My name is Mara Whitaker, and I was 29 years old when my father made the whole backyard laugh at me. It happened on a Saturday evening in late June, behind my Aunt Tessa's house outside Tulsa, where the air smelled like brisket smoke, cut grass, and the sweet tea sweating through plastic cups. There were folding chairs in uneven rows across the lawn, country music playing too low from an old speaker, and enough relatives gathered around the grill to make leaving unnoticed almost impossible. I had almost not come. 4 years away from family gatherings had taught me how peaceful absence could be. But Aunt Tessa had called me herself and said, "Mara, honey, just come for one afternoon. Your mother's been asking about you." That was a lie. My mother never asked about me unless someone else was listening. By sunset, my brother Derek was talking about a commercial property deal in Dallas, and my parents were glowing like he had personally saved the economy. My father, Gordon Whitaker, had a beer in one hand and an audience in front of him. My mother, Pamela, stood beside him with that soft little smile she used whenever she wanted cruelty to look like concern. Then my father turned toward me. "And Mara here," he said loudly. "Well, the army at least taught her how to fold a blanket straight." A few people laughed. My mother touched my arm like she was comforting me, but her voice carried. "She's been sensitive since she came back. We try not to push her." I looked down at my glass of iced tea. The ice had melted into thin, pale circles. Then Dad grinned. "What did they call you over there, sweetheart, G.I. Jane?" I set the glass on the table. "Valkyrie," I said. Behind him, a retired Navy SEAL named Miles Callahan dropped his glass so hard it shattered across the patio. He stared at me, pale and shaking, then stood straight and saluted. That was when the laughter died. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The broken glass stayed scattered near Miles Callahan's shoes, catching the last orange light of the evening, and every face in that backyard turned toward me as if I had become a stranger in the space of one word. But the truth was, I had been a stranger to my family long before that Saturday night. In the Whitaker house, success had always been easy to recognize. It wore a pressed shirt. It shook hands firmly. It bought a house in the right neighborhood, and gave my father something clean to brag about at church, at the dealership, at holiday dinners where everyone measured their children without admitting that was what they were doing. My brother Derek understood that world perfectly. He was 5 years older than me, polished in a way I had never learned to be, with a condo in Dallas and a job selling commercial properties to men who said things like portfolio and leverage while pretending money was wisdom. My parents kept a framed photo of him in their living room from the year he closed his first seven-figure deal. The only picture of me in uniform sat in a drawer beneath old warranty papers and Christmas receipts. I found it there once when I was looking for a phone charger. I never asked why they put it away. Some answers are louder when nobody says them. I had been the girl who took apart broken radios in the garage just to see where the silence came from. The girl who sat through family dinners, counting exits without knowing why. The girl who got accepted to Oklahoma State and lasted 2 semesters before the walls of every classroom started feeling too close. At 19, I enlisted, and my father called it impulsive. My mother called it a phase. Derek called it dramatic, then smiled like the smile made the word kinder. Nobody asked what I was looking for when I signed those papers. They just assumed I was running away from a future they had already approved for me. Maybe I was. The army did not fix me. It gave me structure, exhaustion, purpose, and people who cared more about whether I could stay steady under pressure than whether I looked good in a family photograph. Years later, after Helmand, after the discharge folder, the 2 prescriptions, and the duffel bag I left untouched for 6 months, I took the night shift at a 911 center in Oklahoma City. It was an hour and a half from Tulsa, far enough to breathe and close enough for guilt to keep finding me. My parents hated that job most of all, not because it lacked meaning, but because it was invisible. There was no plaque, no ribbon, no title that made strangers impressed. Just me at 17 inches the morning, wearing a headset, guiding terrified people through the worst minutes of their lives, and somehow, to my family, that still looked like failure. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next heartwarming stories. Before we begin, I want to try something. If you're listening to this story alone, comment 1. If someone is nearby, comment 2. Okay, without further ado, today's story begins here. That was the part my family never understood about invisible work. If they could not photograph it, frame it, or mention it at a dinner table without making the room comfortable, then it did not count. By the time the sun began dropping behind Aunt Tessa's fence line, that old family rule had settled over the barbecue like smoke. The yard looked harmless from the outside. Red checkered tablecloths, clipped to folding tables, paper plates bending under ribs, and potato salad. Little kids chasing each other around the sprinkler, while their parents complained about mortgage rates and school boards. Aunt Tessa kept moving between the kitchen and patio with fresh trays, pretending not to hear the sharper edges in my father's voice. She had always been good at that. In our family, peace usually meant the loudest person got protected. Derek sat near the grill with his phone turned sideways, showing two uncles a photo of some glass office building in Dallas, like it was a newborn baby. Every few minutes, my father glanced toward him with that proud, hungry look parents get when their child reflects well on them. Then his eyes would slide to me, and the pride would thin into something else. I was standing near the cooler, rolling a half-empty water bottle between my palms, when my mother stepped beside me and brushed at my sleeve even though there was nothing on it. "You could have worn something brighter," she said softly. "Black makes you look so severe." I looked down at my shirt. "It's a t-shirt, Mom." "I know, honey. I'm only saying people already think you're hard to approach." There it was. Not an insult exactly, just a small, polished needle. My father heard enough to join in. "Your mother's right. You come to one family event in 4 years and dress like you're about to guard a warehouse." A few relatives laughed because they knew he expected them to. That was how these things worked. My father tossed out the first line, my mother softened it, Derek smiled into his drink, and everyone else decided it was safer to treat me like a joke than a person. Then Gordon lifted his beer toward me. "Come on, Mara. Don't glare. We're proud of your service." The word proud landed wrong. Too smooth. Too public. One cousin asked whether I had ever done anything dangerous overseas. Before I could answer, Dad grinned and said, "Probably classified because it was so boring." I stopped moving the bottle. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to say my name in the tone that meant enough. Instead, she folded a napkin into a neat square and looked away. Something in me went quiet. Not angry, quieter than angry. So when my father finally reached for the one question he thought would embarrass me most, I did not protect him from the answer. The word had barely left my mouth when the sound came from behind my father. Sharp, bright, final. Not a dropped cup, not a plate slipping from someone's hand. Glass breaking has a way of cutting through a crowd before anyone understands why, and every conversation in that yard died at once. Miles Callahan stood near the drink table with his hand still half raised, as if his body had forgotten what it was doing. There was champagne across the patio stones and pieces of glass near his shoes, but he did not look down. He looked at me. Not at my shirt, not at my tired face, not at the version of me my family had been laughing at. He looked at me like a man hearing a door open in a house he thought had burned down years ago. My father chuckled once, uncomfortable now. "Miles, you all right?" Miles did not answer him. He took one step toward me, then another, slow and careful, like sudden movement might make the past disappear. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper than they had been 10 minutes earlier. He had been introduced as an old Navy friend of someone's late husband, just another retired man in a blazer sweating through an Oklahoma evening. But in that moment, every casual thing about him fell away. "Helmand," he said. My throat tightened. No one else reacted, because no one else understood the weight of the word. To them, it was a place on a map, maybe something they had heard on the news years ago while eating dinner. To me, it was dust in my teeth and radio static in my sleep. Miles swallowed. September 2018. I said nothing. His eyes searched my face, and I hated how much he knew without asking. "Dustline support," he said more quietly. You were attached to the extraction crew outside Lashkargah. My mother's smile had vanished. Derek lowered his phone. Aunt Tessa stopped halfway through, setting down a tray of cornbread. My father looked annoyed now, the way he always did when a conversation moved somewhere he could not control. "What is this?" he asked. "Some army thing?" Miles finally turned to him. "No," he said, and his voice had gone flat. "Not some army thing." Then he looked back at me. "You went back the second time." The backyard seemed to shrink around those words. I felt my pulse in my wrists, behind my eyes, under the old scar near my collarbone. For 6 years, I had trained myself not to answer questions like that. Silence had become a kind of shelter. But Miles was not asking for a story. He was confirming a grave. Derek tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "Okay, seriously, what are we talking about?" Miles looked at my brother, then at my parents, and something hard moved through his face. "You don't know," he said. "Do you?" Nobody answered. Miles stepped back from me then, squared his shoulders, and gave my family the kind of look I had spent my whole life wishing someone would give them. "You don't know who your daughter is." For a moment, my father looked almost offended, as if Miles had broken some rule of hospitality by refusing to keep the family joke alive. Gordon Whitaker was used to rooms bending around him. He was used to people laughing when he laughed, and quieting down when his voice got heavier. He was not used to a retired Navy SEAL looking at him like he had failed a test he never knew he was taking. Pamela crossed her arms slowly and said, "Miles, I'm sure Mara did her job. We've never said she didn't. That was my mother's gift. She could make dismissal sound reasonable." Miles stared at her for one long second. "Ma'am, with respect, you don't know what her job was." No one reached for food anymore. The ribs cooled on paper plates. The children had been pulled closer to their parents. Even the country music from the speaker seemed embarrassed to keep playing. Miles dragged a chair from the patio table and sat down across from me, though his attention stayed on my family. "Most call signs are stupid," he said. "Some come from a bad haircut, a bad landing. One dumb night people never let you forget. Soldiers get creative when they're tired and scared." A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth, then disappeared. "But some names aren't jokes." My fingers tightened around the water bottle until the plastic bent inward. Miles looked toward my father. Mara wasn't sitting behind a desk. She was a flight medic attached to an extraction crew supporting a ranger element in Helmand. A dust front came in early. Visibility collapsed. Communications broke apart. Men on the ground were wounded and cut off, and the order came down to pull back. My father's face had gone still. Miles did not soften his voice. "Your daughter heard that order. Then she heard men still alive on the radio." Nobody spoke. "She went in once," he said, "helped load wounded under conditions. Most air crews would have refused. Then she heard there were still men left behind." I closed my eyes for half a second. Miles's voice lowered, and she went back. The backyard seemed to shrink around those words. I felt my pulse in my wrists, behind my eyes, beneath the old scar near my collarbone. For 6 years, I had trained myself not to answer questions like that. Silence had become a kind of shelter. But Miles was not asking me to perform my pain for the family. He was telling them what their jokes had been standing on. Derek's mouth opened, then closed again. Aunt Tessa pressed both hands against the back of a chair like she needed it to stay upright. Miles leaned back, his jaw tight. 18 men came home because she refused to let an order become a death sentence. My mother covered her mouth with one hand. I wanted to tell him to stop. Not because he was lying, because he wasn't. And somehow that made it worse. Then Miles stood. His knees cracked softly, but his posture straightened into something formal and old. He raised his hand to his brow again, slower this time, with the whole backyard watching. "That's why they called her Valkyrie," he said, "because when everyone else believed those men were lost, she went down and brought them back." My father looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time that evening, he had no joke ready. The worst part was that Miles made it sound clean. He had to. There were children in the yard, paper plates on the tables, my mother standing there with one hand pressed to her mouth, as if shock could make her innocent. But nothing about Helmand had been clean. Not the weather, not the radio traffic, not the choices, especially not the choices. I was 23 then, young enough to believe fear was something you could outrun if you stayed useful. Our crew had been running on bad sleep, instant coffee, and the kind of focus that made the rest of the world narrow down to checklists. The mission had not started as anything historic. That was the part people never understood. Most days that change your life begin like any other day. We were supposed to support an early extraction outside Lashkar. A small ranger element had been moving before sunrise, in and out, simple on paper. Nothing in war is ever simple on the ground, but paper has a way of lying politely. I remember the air first, dry, metallic, already restless before the sun came up. The horizon looked bruised. Someone mentioned the dust front over comms, but at first it seemed manageable. Weather always seemed manageable until it wasn't. I was checking trauma supplies for the third time, counting tourniquets, fluids, airway kits, anything my hands could organize so my mind would stay quiet. My thumb kept catching on the same Velcro strap. I remember that more clearly than I remember my own voice. Then the radio started breaking. Static came in waves, swallowing words in the middle of sentences. Coordinates had to be repeated. Voices overlapped. A calm morning began tightening into something else. The ranger team had changed route near a dry canal bed. Then came the first call that made everyone stop pretending this was routine. Contact. One word. Flat and professional. Terrible because of how controlled it sounded. Reports came through in pieces after that. Wounded on the ground. Visibility dropping. Enemy movement near the extraction path. The dust front rolled in harder, turning distance into a dirty wall. I remember looking out and realizing the world beyond the aircraft had become the color of old rust. Colonel Preston Vale was on the command channel. His voice was steady in the way men sound when they want history to remember them as steady. He ordered air assets to pull back until conditions improved. Conditions were not going to improve in time. Someone on the ground came through the static, young and breathless. I never learned his name then. I only heard enough. Tell my mom I tried. No one said anything for half a second. Half a second can hold an entire life. I looked at the crew chief. He looked at me. Neither of us said the thing out loud, but we both knew what the pilot was already thinking. We were not leaving them there. The pilot did not ask for permission twice. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. Some people freeze when the channel fills with authority. He only tightened his grip and banked hard into the dust, the aircraft shuddering like it understood before we did what we were about to attempt. The world outside vanished almost immediately. There was no horizon, no ground, no sky, just a brown wall rushing past the glass, and the instrument lights glowing with a calm that felt almost insulting. Inside, everything became sound and motion. The crew chief called distance in clipped numbers. The pilot answered without emotion. I sat strapped in with my medical bag between my boots, one hand on the overhead grip, the other pressed against the pack as if I could hold the entire aircraft steady by force. My mouth was dry. My heart was moving too fast. I remember thinking, not dramatically, not bravely, just plainly, this is where people disappear. Then the ground appeared too close. The landing was hard enough to slam my shoulder against the harness. Dust swallowed us before the skids settled. The crew chief threw the door open, and hot wind filled the cabin with grit. Shapes moved through it first, not people, just shadows dragging other shadows toward us. Then they became men. Tired men, hurt men, men trying to stay useful even when their bodies were giving out. Training took over, because that is what training is for, not to make you fearless. To give your hands something to do when fear starts shouting. I checked airways, tightened straps, counted bodies, shouted names I could barely hear over the rotor wash. Someone grabbed my wrist and would not let go until I looked at him. His eyes were wide, furious with the terror he was refusing to show. "We got 2 more," he said. The crew chief heard it too. For a second, nobody moved. The aircraft was already too heavy. The dust was closing harder. The pilot's voice came through my headset, low and controlled. "We need to lift." Then another broken transmission scratched through the channel. 2 signals, still alive, behind the canal bed. I looked toward the open door. There was nothing there but dust. Someone said, "Whitaker, don't." I have heard that word in my sleep for 6 years. Don't. As if survival were as simple as obeying the right person at the right moment. As if the people left behind would stop existing just because the order made sense on paper. We lifted, circled, came back lower. The second landing was worse. Faster, rougher. The kind of landing nobody brags about later because bragging would make it sound cleaner than it was. We got them in. That is all I will say about that part. We got them in. And when the aircraft finally clawed its way out of the dust, nobody cheered. Nobody said hero. One of the Rangers just leaned his forehead against the floor and whispered something I could not hear. Later, they told me that was when the name started. Valkyrie. I hated it at first. It sounded too big for what I had felt, because I had not felt brave. I had felt scared, angry, and unwilling to let a living voice become a memory, because someone important had decided the risk looked bad on a report. 18 men came home from that mission. Not all of them. Never all of them. That is the part people leave out when they call you a hero. They count the saved because the number sounds better than the silence beside it. But I carried both. I still do. Coming home did not feel like coming home. People imagine the flight back, the clean sheets, the first real shower, the relief of still being alive. They do not imagine fluorescent offices, sealed folders, men with polished boots asking questions they had already decided the answers to. They do not imagine surviving the worst day of your life, and then being told, very calmly, that the worst day was your fault. Colonel Preston Vale never raised his voice. That was what made him dangerous. Loud men are easy to recognize. Vale spoke like a policy memo given a heartbeat. Smooth, controlled, reasonable. He used phrases that sounded clean enough to belong on official letterhead. Operational discipline, unnecessary exposure, failure to follow withdrawal protocol. Every sentence made cowardice look responsible, and responsibility look reckless. The first interview happened 48 hours after the mission. I was still running on fragments of sleep. My hands shook whenever I reached for a paper cup. Someone slid a printed timeline across the table and asked why our aircraft re-entered the zone after the pullback order. I said there were living men still transmitting. The man taking notes did not look up. He only asked whether I understood the chain of command. That was when I first understood what was happening. They did not want the story. They wanted a shape they could file. Preston Vale had given the order to retreat before the ground team was secured. If the report said that plainly, his career would carry the stain, so the report learned to speak around him. It said the situation had deteriorated unexpectedly. It said field personnel acted outside recommended parameters. It said emotional urgency may have influenced tactical judgment. Emotional urgency. That was what they called hearing a wounded soldier say goodbye to his mother over a broken radio. I tried to fight it. I wrote statements. I requested corrections. I named times, channels, crew members, everything I could remember. A captain I trusted told me quietly in a hallway that I should stop pushing before I damaged my future any further. He said it kindly. That made it worse. Within months, doors began closing without anyone admitting they had touched the handle. Assignments changed, recommendations disappeared. People who had slapped my shoulder after the mission suddenly found reasons not to meet my eyes. The surviving men were scattered across units, hospitals, homes, silence. Some were still healing. Some had families begging them not to reopen anything. Vale, meanwhile, kept rising. By the time I left the army, The official version had settled over my name like dust. Not enough to destroy me loudly, just enough to make every room colder when I entered it. I came back to Oklahoma with a discharge folder, a handful of prescriptions, and a lesson I hated learning. Sometimes the people who bury you do it with clean hands. If you enjoy stories about family, human nature, and karma, please subscribe to the channel. I'm asking honestly, have you ever been looked down upon by someone? If so, comment 9. If not, come on sept. Perhaps today's story will remind you of something deeply ingrained in your heart. I did not tell my parents the rest that night. Not all of it. There are truths you can drop into a backyard, and truths that require stronger walls. After Miles said my name like it meant something, the barbecue never found its way back to normal. People whispered. My mother cried quietly in a way that made other people comfort her. My father kept opening his mouth, then closing it again. For once, he had no easy joke to stand behind. Miles waited until I walked toward the side gate before he followed me. There's something you should know, he said. I was staring at the gravel driveway, trying to remember how to breathe, like a person who had not just been opened in public. I don't need another surprise tonight. I know. His voice softened. But Preston Vale is speaking tomorrow in Fort Worth. The name hit harder than it should have. 6 years had passed, but some names do not age. They stay exactly where they were, waiting. At what? I asked. Veterans Leadership Dinner. Fundraiser. Big room. Donors. Local press. He paused. Topic is leadership under fire. I almost laughed. Nothing came out. That night, I drove back to Oklahoma City, with the windows down and the radio off. Tulsa disappeared behind me, in pieces of streetlight and dark highway. My phone buzzed twice. My mother, then Derek. I let both calls die. There was no version of the conversation I could survive before morning. I did not sleep much. At 3:12 a.m., I sat at my kitchen table in the same black t-shirt, drinking coffee I did not want, staring at my work badge beside the salt shaker. I had spent years telling myself peace meant staying away from rooms where men like Vale were applauded. Maybe that had been peace, or maybe it had only been a quieter kind of cage. By evening, I was standing outside the Fort Worth hotel where the dinner was being held, regretting every mile that brought me there. Inside, everything gleamed. Polished floors, white tablecloths, American flags. Men in suits laughing with the soft confidence of people who had never been questioned by a locked door or a sealed file. Miles found me near the entrance and gave a small nod. Not pity, not encouragement, just recognition. Then I saw Preston Vale. He stood near the stage, silver-haired and perfect, shaking hands beneath warm chandelier light. When his eyes found mine, his smile vanished for less than a second. But I saw it. Fear recognizes itself. His speech began 20 minutes later. He spoke beautifully about duty, sacrifice, and command decisions made under pressure. Then his gaze moved toward the back of the room. Unfortunately, he said, some former personnel carry trauma in ways that distort memory. They build legends around moments they never fully understood. Miles stood first. I was there, he said. Then Colton Reyes rose from a middle table, one hand gripping the back of his chair. So was I. A woman named Marjorie Bell stepped forward holding a worn photograph against her chest. My son came home because of her. The room changed. Not loudly, deeply. And at the press table near the wall, Owen Sutter lifted his recorder. Owen Sutter did not publish the story that night. He was too careful for that, which I respected. Careful people had been rare in my life. He called Miles first, then Colton, then two other names I had not heard spoken in years. By Monday morning, the article was online with a headline that did not call me a hero. I was grateful for that. It simply said that new witnesses had challenged a retired colonel's version of a failed Afghanistan extraction. That was enough. The story moved through veteran circles faster than anything I had ever seen. My phone began vibrating before I finished my first cup of coffee. Some calls came from numbers I did not recognize. Some messages were only a few words. We knew. You were right. He should have answered for it years ago. One former medic sent a photograph of a dusty aircraft bay, all of us younger, thinner, smiling like people who had no idea what was coming. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember the girl I had been before survival became her main personality. Colton texted me at noon. "You were never forgotten." I read that sentence 3 times and still did not know what to do with it. For years, I had mistaken silence for abandonment. It had never occurred to me that some people had been carrying their own locked rooms, their own orders not to speak, their own injuries that made truth feel expensive. That did not fix anything, but it changed the shape of the loneliness. My family changed too, though not cleanly. Families rarely do anything cleanly. Derek left a voicemail that began with, "I don't know what to say," and then proved it for almost 2 minutes. My mother sent a text with too many heart emojis, and the sentence, "I wish you had told us." I put the phone face down after reading that. She still thought my silence had been the problem. 3 days after the dinner, my father came to my house in Oklahoma City. I saw his truck through the kitchen window while I was washing a coffee mug. He sat in the driveway for nearly 5 minutes before getting out. Gordon Whitaker had always entered rooms like he owned the air inside them, but that morning he moved slowly, carrying a small white bakery bag like it might protect him. When I opened the door, he lifted it. "Peach turnovers," he said. I looked at the bag, then at him. "That's not an apology." His face tightened, but he nodded. "No, it isn't." For the first time in my life, my father did not try to win the moment. He stood on my porch, older than I remembered, and said quietly, "I don't know how to apologize for laughing at something I was too ignorant to understand." I stepped aside, but only a little. "You can start," I said, "by not explaining why you did it." My father came inside that morning, but he did not stay long. Maybe because he finally understood that being allowed through the door was not the same thing as being forgiven. He sat at my kitchen table with a peach turnover untouched in front of him, his hands folded around a paper napkin, and listened while I told him one simple rule. If he wanted to know me now, he had to stop asking questions, like a man trying to clear his own conscience. He had to ask them like a father willing to hear answers that would make him uncomfortable. He nodded. He did not defend himself. That mattered more than the pastry. 2 days later, Preston Vale called. I almost let it go to voicemail. His name on my screen looked wrong, like a stain on something clean. For 6 years, I had imagined what I would say if I ever had him alone without rank, without a podium, without men in polished shoes protecting the shape of his reputation. In my imagination, I was always sharper, crueler. I always knew exactly where to cut. Real life was quieter. We met at a diner outside Denton, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths, weak coffee, and a waitress who called everyone baby whether they deserved tenderness or not. Vale was already there when I walked in. Without the stage lights, he looked smaller. Not physically. Something else had shrunk. The silver-haired confidence was gone, and all that remained was an old man in a navy jacket staring at his hands. He stood when he saw me. I did not tell him to sit, but I did not shake his hand either. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The waitress poured coffee between us and moved away like she could feel the table had history. Finally, Vale said, "I was afraid." That was it. 3 words. No speech about impossible conditions. No lecture about command pressure. Just the small, ugly truth sitting there between the sugar packets. I looked at him and waited. The storm moved in faster than expected, he continued. Comms were failing. I told myself pulling back was tactical. I told myself I was preserving resources for a larger response. "You told yourself a lot," I said. His mouth tightened. Yes, the honesty did not heal me. That surprised me, even though it shouldn't have. I had spent years thinking an admission would unlock something. But pain is not a door, and truth is not always a key. Sometimes truth is only a light turned on in a room that is still wrecked. Vale looked down at his coffee. "I hated your name," he said quietly, "because every time I heard it, I remembered who I was when it mattered. I felt nothing dramatic then. No victory. No release. Just a tired sadness for the years all of us had lost to his fear. He asked if I could forgive him. I watched traffic slide past the diner window, ordinary people going ordinary places, and said, "Forgiveness is not something you request because confession finally became convenient." His eyes closed. "I won't destroy you," I added, "but I won't carry your shame for you anymore." And for the first time, he had to sit alone with it. After I left the diner, nothing magical happened. The sky did not split open. The old weight in my chest did not disappear somewhere between Denton and Oklahoma City. I still stopped at a gas station halfway home and sat in my truck for 10 minutes with both hands on the steering wheel, too tired to start the engine. That was the truth about healing nobody puts on plaques. It rarely feels like victory. Most of the time, it feels like being asked to carry the same life with slightly less poison in your hands. I went back to work the following Monday. The 911 center looked exactly the same as it always had. Gray carpet, humming monitors, stale coffee, fluorescent lights that made everyone look a little unfinished. At 2:17 inches the morning, a call came in from a woman whose husband had collapsed in their bathroom. My voice steadied before the rest of me did. I guided her through the steps, kept her breathing, kept her listening, kept her from disappearing into panic before the paramedics arrived. When the line ended, I sat there for a moment, with my headset still on, and understood something I had missed for years. I had never stopped doing what I did in Helmand. The place had changed. The uniform was gone. The aircraft was gone. But the work was still the same. Stay calm enough to bring someone through the worst minute of their life. My mother asked to see me that weekend. I told her yes, but only if she came without speeches, without tears meant to make me comfort her, and without calling me sensitive like it was a diagnosis. She agreed. Derek called too. For once, he did not mention Dallas, buildings, or money. He only asked, "Are you okay?" I told him the truth. Not completely, but enough. A month later, Miles invited me to a small veterans support group in Fort Worth. I almost said no. Old habits have strong hands. But I went. No stage, no applause. Just folding chairs, bad coffee, and people trying to learn how to live with memories that did not ask permission to stay. Near the end, a young veteran sitting by the wall asked me if people could ever really come back. I thought about Helmand, about my parents' backyard, about Preston Vale sitting alone with his shame, about my father standing on my porch with peach turnovers and no excuse ready. Not the way we were, I said, but enough to live again. For years, I thought Valkyrie meant I was supposed to bring other people out of hell. I understand it differently now. Sometimes the person you spend the longest trying to bring home is yourself. What Mara's story reminds us is that some of the strongest people in our families are not the ones who talk the loudest, earn the most, or look the most successful from the outside. Sometimes the strongest person is the quiet one at the end of the table, the one everyone misunderstands, the one who stopped explaining because nobody ever really listened. Family should be the place where your pain is handled with care. But sometimes family becomes the first place where your wounds are mocked, minimized, or turned into a joke. And when that happens, it can make a person feel like silence is safer than truth. But silence does not mean weakness. Mara carried things her parents never bothered to understand. They saw her uniform, but not the cost behind it. They saw her quietness, but not the discipline it took to keep living. They saw her night shift job and called it failure, never realizing she was still doing what she had always done, staying calm in the dark so someone else could make it through. That is a lesson many of us need. Do not measure people only by what you can brag about. Do not assume you know someone's story just because they do not tell it loudly. And never laugh at a scar you have not asked about with love. Real strength is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is getting up for another shift, answering the phone, opening the door a little, but not so wide that people can hurt you the same way again. Sometimes healing means setting a boundary and letting people earn their way back slowly. Mara did not need revenge to become whole. She needed the truth to stop being buried. She needed her pain to stop being treated like an inconvenience. And most of all, she needed to understand that coming home is not always a place. Sometimes it is a decision to stop abandoning yourself. If this story touched you, I'd love to know your thoughts. Have you ever been misunderstood by the people closest to you? Leave a comment below. And if you want more emotional stories about family, truth, and resilience, please like this video and subscribe to the channel.